It was not the sword that failed me. That is the lie they told in court, at the tribunal, on the parchment they sealed with broken wax and the smell of war still fresh on their fingers. The general, they said, lacked resolve. That word resolve used like a scalpel, sharp and clinical, as if what I did was a matter of nerve or calculation or cowardice. As if they had any idea what it cost. It was not the sword. I kept it sharp. I kept it clean. I kept it from tasting blood, and in doing so, I committed the only act of violence I've ever believed in. They will not carve that into my gravestone. Instead, they will remember the names of the men I did not kill. They will whisper of the fortress I did not take. They will use my name to frighten the new recruits, not because I was ruthless, but because I wasn't. There was a boy. His name is not important, because he is dead. They said the enemy had recruited children, that they had given him a blade too heavy for his arms, and sent him running down the hillside with a flag pinned to his back, hoping he'd draw fire long enough for the archers to find their range. It was a clever tactic. It was monstrous. It was common. He was 12. I saw his teeth chattering as he ran, not from fear, but from cold. It was early spring, and the rains had made the soil a swamp. He was barefoot. He slipped 3 times and kept getting up, because someone was watching. He did not know I had ordered no archers that day. He did not know that I had watched the formation from my saddle and told my men, let him pass. They obeyed. Because back then, they still thought I was planning something. By nightfall, the hillside was littered with broken flags and empty helmets, and no one could explain why the enemy withdrew when they had the high ground. I knew why. Because their commander, an old man named Rana, had watched us watch the boy. Because he understood something about war that I had only recently come to understand, that sometimes you win when you refuse to play. They call it betrayal. I call it choosing the harder path. There were 23 campaigns before that one. I kept the records myself. Although the official counts would disagree, they always do. Victories, defeats, logistics, percentages of losses per town taken, civilian versus combatant ratios. All neatly tabulated. But there is no column for regret. No scroll for the names of children whose mothers never received a body. No line where I can write down the girl whose wrist was broken by the horse of my quartermaster as she fled with stolen bread. Ugh. There is only ink. And the scent of iron in the soil. I used to think my job was to protect the realm. That war, with all its brutality, was a necessary ugliness like lancing a boil or burning a wound closed. That what we did had purpose. I still think that. But I have changed what I believe the realm is. It is not the king. He has not set foot on a battlefield in 18 years. It is not the court. Their silk gloves are too clean, their words too oily. It is not the crown. It is not the law. It is not even the land. It is the people. And the moment I believed that truly believed it, I became a traitor. My brother was the first man I killed. He was older, better looking, funnier. The kind of man who made soldiers laugh and peasants kneel. I was the shadow in his wake. He died in the 3rd winter of the famine, when we were both stationed in the northern ridge. Our supplies had not come. Our men were eating boiled bark. He stole grain from the villagers. They were starving. So I took his knife, and I used it. That is what leadership was. I told myself. Doing the thing no one else could. Bearing the burden. Making the cruel decisions so others didn't have to. That was the story I told to the men, to myself, to the spirits of I still prayed to in secret when the tents fell silent. But the truth is simpler. I killed my brother to prove to the army that I was strong enough to lead them. And it worked. They followed me for 20 years. I never told them that every time I held a map, my hands shook. Not with fear, with the weight of what I had become. The king asked for complete submission. He wanted the enemy cleansed. His words, it was a mountain village. They had risen once 5 years ago when tax collectors burned their food stores. They resisted. They were punished. But now, a new prince had been born, and the king wanted to begin his reign with a message. He ordered me to raze the place. I rode alone, ahead of the army, wearing no insignia. I entered their village square and waited. The chieftain came out. She was a woman in her 60s. Her hair was the colour of frost and her eyes were clear. She asked if I had come to parley. I said yes. She brought me tea in a cracked bowl. No guards, no threats, just steam and silence. I told her what the king had ordered. She did not flinch. She asked me, "And what will you do?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. The next morning, I forged a false report. I claimed the village had been abandoned. I instructed my men to burn a nearby forest as a decoy. I let the villagers flee. I told no one. Not because I feared punishment, but because I feared faith. They believed in me, my men, believed I would do what was necessary. But I had begun to question what necessary meant, and I didn't want to break them. Not yet. Do you know what war does to time? It stretches it, bends it. War makes you feel ancient and newborn in the same breath. You can kill a man before breakfast and cradle a dying friend by lunch. You can laugh at a joke over soup while your boots are still wet with someone else's blood. It makes monsters of everyone. Not because we enjoy it, but because we must, or we shatter. I began to see it in their eyes. My men. The way they avoided mirrors. The way they drank in silence. The way they stopped writing letters. It was not fear that haunted them. It was shame. But shame has no place on the battlefield. So they buried it. And it rotted. I buried mine too. But it sprouted. Into doubt. Into defiance. Into something dangerously close to mercy. I remember the last battle I truly believed in. It was near the river, the border skirmish that history now pretends was a decisive victory. What the scrolls don't say is that we were outnumbered, that we were exhausted, that we had no cause being there. But we fought anyway. Not for glory, not even for duty. We fought because we knew the men across from us. They had been our allies once. Their commander had shared bread with me under siege. Their archers had saved my flank at the Battle of the Split Fields. But now, they wore different colours, and for that, they had to die. When I struck down their standard-bearer, a boy of 19, he smiled at me as he fell. Child. And I knew in that moment that I had lost something permanent. I think it was myself. The tribunal came 2 winters later. They charged me with dereliction of duty, with falsifying reports, with treason. They were not wrong. I had ordered men to stand down when told to attack. I had lied to spare civilians. I had diverted supplies from soldiers to refugees. I had defied the king. But not for power. Not for gold. For silence. For the hope that if I stopped shouting orders long enough, I might finally hear my own voice again. I did not speak at the trial. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew they would not hear it. They had already decided what I was: coward, heretic, traitor. Perhaps if I was all 3. But I left the courtroom with one thought: that the names of the men I didn't kill would not be etched in stone, but perhaps, somewhere, in the cry of a newborn girl not orphaned, in the whisper of wind through unburnt leaves, in the quiet meals of farmers whose fields were spared. Perhaps there, my name still echoes, not as a general, but as a man who chose not to win. They sent me into exile. But not far. A man like me cannot be buried quietly, not with too many ears remembering my voice, too many soldiers who would ask where I'd gone. So instead, they appointed me to oversee security in the western frontier, a place that hadn't seen war in a decade and wouldn't again for another 5. I was given a tower. Burnt stone. Cold in summer, colder in winter. A garrison of 22 men who had not seen real combat and didn't wish to. A desk, a sealed trunk, a daily courier who rarely brought anything more than weather reports and the occasional irrelevant decree. They thought it was punishment. But I knew what it really was: a silencing. They buried me under routine, smothered me with stillness, erased me from the rhythm of war by pretending I'd chosen peace. But peace cannot be assigned. It must be earned. And I had not earned it yet. There is a kind of rot that sets into men who no longer have to pretend. At the front, we are all actors. Even our violence is a performance. Timed, choreographed, explained. Every order is justified before it is given. Every death has a narrative. But in exile, there is no need to explain. And so, the masks begin to crack. My second in command, Sir Roland, drank with quiet intensity. He played dice in the dark and muttered things to the fire. One night, I found him on the parapet, whispering the names of every man he had ever killed. He had carved tally marks into the stone not to boast, but to remember. Do you think they count them? He asked me once. In the afterlife. I didn't answer. Because I was beginning to wonder the same thing. Once a week, I walked the perimeter alone. Not for defense. There was nothing to defend. But because I needed to feel the air bite at my face. To smell the frost on the rocks. To remind myself that I was still a body, not just a ghost given form by duty and disgrace. It was during one of these walks that I found her. A girl no older than 14, curled against the roots of a dead tree. She was shaking. Her hands were blue, her feet wrapped in strips of torn linen. She had escaped something. You can always tell. The way the body folds inward, not from cold, but from memory. She did not speak. Not for 3 days. I fed her broth, gave her my cot, kept the men away. On the 4th day, she told me her name was Calla. On the 5th, she said her village had been burned by those who wear black cloaks but carry no flags. Mercenaries. The king had begun hiring them more and more, now that men like me had proven too principled for his liking. They were cheaper, crueler, easier to throw away. Calla's mother had hidden her under a pile of salted hides. It worked. For a time. I sent word. To the capital. To the garrison command. To the church. No one responded. Silence, after all, was part of the sentence. So I made a decision. I took Calla in. Taught her how to hold a knife, how to read maps, how to fake sleep while listening to men who think you are too young to understand. She was quick. Quieter than most. She began walking the walls with me, writing notes in the margins of the logs. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would sit upright and whisper, "Fire." I did not ask for details, because I already knew. There was one thing I kept hidden from her from all of them. The truck. It sat beneath my desk, locked with 3 iron clasps. Inside were the original reports, the false maps, the fake seals, everything I had forged, stolen, or concealed to stop the deaths I had once been ordered to deliver. Every lie I'd ever told to save a life was in that trunk. I knew that one day someone would find it, and when they did, they would not know what to call it. Mercy, treason, proof. It depends who holds the key. One spring, a rider arrived unannounced. He wore the sigil of the High Court, but not its uniform. His cloak was dust-streaked, his horse too thin. He did not ask to enter. Simply handed me a letter and turned away. The seal was broken. Inside, a summons. A war was brewing in the south. A rebellion real this time. Not peasants or bandits, but former officers, minor nobles, deserting knights, veterans who had seen too much, believed too little. They were rising. Not for the throne, but against it. And they wanted me to lead them. Not in name. In strategy. In silence. They had heard of the boy on the hillside. The mountain village. The supply wagons that disappeared and ended up in starving towns. The enemies that were never pursued. The lines never crossed. They knew I had refused to win. And they thought I could teach them how. I told Calla everything. We sat by the hearth. The men were asleep. Roland snored like thunder. Outside, it was snowing. She listened without speaking. Then she asked, "Will you go?" And I said, "Yes." "But not to fight." She frowned. "Then why?" "Because they are about to become the thing they hate, and someone must remind them what it costs." She didn't understand not then. She would. We met in the ruins of an old monastery, 2 days' ride from the front. There were 12 of them, leaders of the rebellion. Hardened men, harder women. Not idealists, survivors. Their eyes were alert, their hands calloused. They laid out their plan. Precision, ruthlessness, shock and awe. They had studied the king's tactics. They had learned from his brutality. And they wanted to use it against him. I told them no, not like this. They scoffed, called me soft, called me broken. But one woman, Captain Myrel, waited. And then she asked, "What do you propose?" I told them my version of victory. Starvation without siege. Confusion without slaughter. Defection without shame. Subversion, not with fire, but with mercy. I showed them how to win by refusing to dominate. They were quiet. Then Myrel said, "It'll take longer." I nodded. She said, "It'll cost more." I said, "Only at first." She said, "They'll call it cowardice." And I replied, "Only if it works." That night, I returned to my tower. Calla was gone. In her place was the trunk. Oh. And empty. There was a note in her handwriting. 4 words, they deserve the truth. I stared at the paper until dawn. And then I wept. Not from betrayal, but from hope. Because she had understood, after all. It has been 5 years since the rebellion began. It has not ended, but it has changed. There are no mass slaughters, no villages burned, no children conscripted. The king's lines shrink not from battles lost, but from loyalty withdrawn. Towns refuse to send supplies. Priests refuse to bless his banners. Whispers turn to silence, and silence turns to dissent. I do not ride at the front. But my maps do. Why tactics? My stories. And somewhere, perhaps, Calla does too. I do not expect to live much longer. There are bounty slips with my face on them. The tower is watched. But every night, I walk the walls. I count the stars. I think of the boy on the hillside. The woman with the tea. The village that never burned. The girl who ran from fire and learned to light her own. And I remind myself, victory is not the taking of power. It is the refusal to become it. There is a sound I no longer hear in dreams, the clash of steel. Not because it no longer echoes in the world, but because I have stopped believing in its music. There was a time when I found rhythm in it. Beauty, even. The choreography of violence, the tilt of shields, the timing of cavalry, the elegance of a perfect flank. I studied it like a priest studies scripture. Reverent, hungry, devout. Now I dream of different sounds. The soft crush of hooves on wet grass, the rattle of a spoon in a wooden bowl. The whisper of chalk on a rebel map, rewriting a battle plan to leave a valley untouched. I once thought legacy was measured in statues and scars. Now I believe it is measured in what we choose to leave unharmed. They sent an assassin in the 7th winter. He was young, clumsy, starved. Not a professional, a boy someone promised. Gold or food or favour. He snuck through the storage tunnel under the east wall, carrying a dagger wrapped in cloth and a vial of poison that had already cracked in the cold. He tried to stab me in the back while I was reading. It would have worked, had I not heard his breathing. That shallow, panicked rhythm, the breath of someone unused to stillness. I turned, caught his wrist, disarmed him. He was crying. He wasn't a killer. He was hungry. I fed him. Asked his name. He said, Kale. I think he lied. That was fine. He said his brother had died in the fires of the Southern Purge, burned alive in a barn after refusing to surrender a rebel messenger. The king had ordered it. The boy Cale had believed that killing me would end something. I told him the truth. That there were no endings, only changes in direction. He stayed the night. In the morning, he was gone. He left behind the dagger and a flower plucked from the last frost of winter, placed beside my ledger. There are people who believe forgiveness is weakness. They believe it absolves too much, too easily. That to forgive is to forget, to dishonor the dead, to rewrite the past. But I do not believe that. I think forgiveness is the only act that allows time to continue without rotting the soul. When I forgave the boy, it was not because I thought he deserved it. It was because I no longer wanted to carry what the king had taught us both to believe, that punishment is purity, that idea is poison. And I was done drinking it. They burned the school in Riverbend in Year 9, not because it taught rebellion, but because it taught to question. The new governor, a crown loyalist named Darnell, claimed that teaching arithmetic and language to peasant girls was subversive, that education was a weapon, and that those who wielded it might one day rise above their station. He was right. And that is why he feared it. Calla was there. She had become a teacher. She had taken a false name, Belen, I think, and begun planting gardens in empty courtyards, not flowers, curriculums, lessons, raps, quiet revolutions drawn in charcoal and patience. When Darnell's men came, she stood in the courtyard. She did not run. She asked them, "Do you know who I am?" They did not. That was her victory, because revolution, if it is to last, must become untraceable. They dragged her away. The children survived. The building did not. I received the message 3 weeks later, scrawled on cloth, smuggled through a merchant caravan. One sentence: they burned the books, not the memory. I read it aloud that night by firelight. And I smiled, because I had taught her well. They say that a king rules with law. But laws are only words until a man chooses to enforce them. And enforcement is not about justice. It is about imagination. The imagination of cruelty, to twist law into fear, to wield interpretation as a weapon sharper than any blade, and the imagination of power, to believe that your comfort is worth another's cage. The king's imagination was vast. He imagined a realm where silence meant loyalty, where obedience meant peace, where victory was measured in maps drawn red. But I have learned a different imagination, one where power is not kept, but broken apart and handed back, where silence is not consent, but resistance, where maps are drawn not in conquest, but in questions. This is not idealism. It is reconstruction. I have grown old. Not in years, though the lines around my eyes have deepened, and my bones ache with the memory of too many winters. I have grown old in knowledge, old in patience, old in the quiet realization that no one is coming to vindicate you, that no monument will be built for restraint, that those who stopped a war will always be forgotten faster than those who started one. But I am at peace with this, because the peace I helped build, imperfect, unstable, slow, is not about me. It is about the towns that now question conscription, the farmers who refuse to tie the grain for armies, the smiths who dull blades just slightly before shipping them to the capital, the girls who learn numbers in basements, the boys who bury their fathers' swords and plant onions in the same soil. These are not headlines. They are not medals. But they are the only measure I need. I received one last letter from Calla. Ink faded. Corners torn. It had travelled far. Inside, she wrote of a child. Not hers. A boy left behind after a raid, feral and mute. She had taken him in. Taught him letters. Helped him speak. He had begun to ask questions. And she did not answer all of them. I do not need him to become a soldier, she wrote. I need him to stay soft, even when the world tells him it is dangerous. That is legacy, not glory, but the courage to leave someone whole. I read her letter in full only once. Then I burned it. Not from shame, but because I knew that if it ever fell into the wrong hands, her words could be twisted into confession, and her child would lose her. That is what survival means in the long war. Not truth, but protection. Tomorrow, they say the tower may fall. The king has sent new mercenaries, better funded, better trained, with orders to clean up what they call the last remnants. I will not run, not because I am brave, but because they expect me to, and I no longer give them what they expect. If I die, I want it to be on my terms, with my boots polished, with the last page of my journal left blank for someone else to finish, and with the hope that the soldiers who burn this place down will find nothing but empty walls and echoes. Let them listen closely. Perhaps, if they are quiet enough, they'll hear the sound of peace still unfinished, still imperfect but echoing, not with steel, but with restraint. They will say, I betrayed the crown. They will not be wrong. But I did not betray my country. I did not betray the people. I did not betray the promise I made when I first held a blade and asked what it was for. I refused to win in a system that demanded I become what I feared. I refused to rise by crushing. I refused to rule by erasing. And so I leave you not with a victory, but a question. What would happen if we all laid down our swords, not because we were finished fighting, but because we finally remembered why we started? The night before they came, the sky cleared. I remember this because it had not been clear for weeks, always the mist, the drizzle, the weight of unspoken things pressing from above. But tonight, the stars were visible again. I sat on the parapet. No armor. No sword. Just a blanket across my shoulders and a flask of boiled wine gone lukewarm. The wind carried no warnings. No drums. No banners. That was their strategy. Now, no spectacle, no theatrics. Just silence and fire. Across the valley, lights flickered behind distant treetops, too disciplined to be villages, too still to be caravans. I knew they were waiting, perhaps to strike at dawn, perhaps to surround this tower and starve it like the old campaigns, not with siege weapons, but with time. I had been on the other side of this before. The slow tightening, the ritual of inevitability. Now, I would feel it from within, and I was not afraid. Not anymore. There is something I must confess, not to clear my conscience, but to clarify it. There were moments I did consider burning everything. When Calais was taken, when Riverbend fell, when the Council of the Rebellion debated executing prisoners to send a message, I stood in those rooms. I heard those arguments. I felt the heat of vengeance swelling in my chest like bile. And I thought, what if I stopped resisting? What if I allowed myself to be the man they accused me of being? It would be so easy to paint cruelty with logic, to call fire strategy, to let grief ferment into purpose and call it justice. I came close. Yes. It was year 11. A detachment of royal enforcers was moving through the lowlands, burning sympathizers' homes, hunting for a rumour of a schoolhouse. I had them surrounded. I had the high ground. I had the men. I had the rage. And I gave the order. Not to attack, but to let them pass. My captains questioned me. My scouts glared in disbelief. Even Roland, who had followed me through frost and fire, pulled me aside and whispered, if not now, when? I said nothing, because I didn't know the answer. But I knew the cost, and I would not pay it. Not again. Not even for victory. In the years that followed, I watched those same enforcers hang their uniforms in taverns and disappear into quiet towns. Not because we defeated them, but because we did not become them. That is a truth us have rarely spoken aloud. Even now, it feels fragile, as if naming it might unravel it. But I must, because history is not written in ink. It is written in rumour, in repetition, In the quiet decisions no one witnesses, the man spared at a checkpoint, the refugee given false papers, the woman taught to read behind locked doors. It is written by refusal. And no one builds statues to refusal. But they should. Roland died last spring. He fell ill during the thaw. Something in the lungs. It took him, quickly. In his final days, he asked to see the ledgers again, the maps, the letters, the forged decrees. The trunk I once kept sealed in the tower's cellar, now a makeshift archive of quiet mutinies. He ran his fingers across the paper as if it were skin. Whispered names the I hadn't heard in years. Then he looked up and said, "We were wrong, weren't we? Not in what we did, but in thinking no one would ever care." I told him the truth. They won't care the way we wanted them to. Not in parades. Not in books, but some child will live because of what we chose not to do. There has to be enough. He smiled. Then he died. And I wept over his body, not because he was gone, but because he finally believed it was enough. The first arrow struck the east wall at dawn. Not an attack. A message, wrapped around the shaft. A note in royal script. You are offered surrender and trial. You will not be executed if you comply. Mercy, written in the language of domination. They do not understand what they offer, because surrender has never meant obedience to me. Only honesty. And I have already surrendered, not to them, but to the truth of what I've done, of what I've refused to do, of what I've allowed to rot, and what I've kept alive. So I did not answer. I let the arrow remain in the stone, and I made tea. At midday, they surrounded the tower. I watched from the battlements. No banners, just a ring of silence and expectation. Crossbows aimed. Torches unlit but ready. Horses shifting, men sweating, hands tightening on leather grips. All the rituals of war without the music. I wondered if they thought I would fight, that I would make some noble last stand, fire from the tower, sword raised high, a martyr's death to seal the legend. But I do not believe in martyrs, only in consequences. So I descended this stairs slowly, folded my coat, and sat at the long oak table where I had written my quietest orders. Then I opened the doors and waited. It was a woman who entered first, not a soldier, not a knight. The scribe. She wore no weapon, carried only a satchel of scrolls and a single quill. She did not introduce herself. She simply asked, "Will you speak?" I nodded, and for the first time in many years, I told my story, not in whispers, but aloud. I told her about the boy on the hill. The village, never burned. The maps I forged. The prisoners I released. The deaths if I stopped. And the deaths if I couldn't. I told her everything. Not to be understood, but to be known. When I finished, she did not look horrified. She looked tired. Then, she said, "There will be no trial." I blinked. Then why the summons? She unrolled a scroll. It was blank. Then she placed it on the table and said, "Because the story is yours to write, or let them write it for you." And she left. No cuffs. No accusations. No sword. Only silence. Only choice. So here I sit. The quill in my hand. The scroll before me. The tower quiet, save for wind and memory. And I begin to write. Not for redemption. Not for glory. But for Calla. For Roman. For the boy who smiled as he died. For the women who lit candles in broken churches and refused to give their sons to kings. For the men who buried their swords under floorboards and sang lullabies instead of marching songs. For the countless, nameless ones who chose restraint when vengeance was easier. This is not a confession. It is a record of refusal, a list of absences, a map of what we spared. They will not teach this in academies. But if someone finds this parchment, if the ink survives the years, let it say this: he was given every reason to conquer. And he chose instead to remember. Memory is a treacherous companion. It carries the weight of all you have refused to forget, and all you desperately wish to erase. I remember the faces, not the generals or shishus, not the heralds or the councilmen, but the children, the mothers, the farmers, the smiths, the ones who did not make it into the stories. I remember a woman named Lyra. She was neither noble nor notable. Her hands were cracked from labour. Her eyes were fierce with exhaustion. She had lost 3 sons to the king's wars before I met her. She did not curse. She did not beg. She simply said, "You will not burn my village." I had no authority to promise that, but I did, and I kept it. There is a saying among soldiers, to fight is to destroy, but to refuse to fight can be just as destructive. The destruction is slower. It is quieter. It seeps into the bones, into the land, into the silence that follows. Refusal carries its own scars, its own ghosts, its own burdens heavier than any sword. I have spent my years between those scars, between the victories that declined and the defeats I survived. I have asked myself often what it means to win. Is it the taking of land, the crushing of enemies, the claiming of crowns, or is it something else, something smaller, something quieter? I once asked Kala after the school burned, after the rebellion fractured, what she thought victory would look like. She said, "Victory is when a child no longer has to learn to hide." I think about that often, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. The day I put down my sword for the last time was not marked by fanfare. No trumpets, no cheers, no solemn vows. It was a cold morning, the sky grey and heavy. The wind whispered through the trees. I folded the blade carefully. I wrapped it in cloth, and I placed it beneath the stones, where no one would find it, where it could not be used, where it would rest. I do not know what history will say of me. I do not expect statues, or songs, or tales told by firesides, but I hope, someday, someone will read this and understand. That courage is not always loud. That resistance can be quiet. That to refuse to win in a world that demands conquest is a victory of a different kind. I am no hero. I am no legend. I am a man who chose to carry the burden of mercy in a time that prized power above all. And I leave this record as my last command. Remember the unmade choice. Honor the absent fight. Cherish the quiet victories. Because sometimes the greatest victory is the one you never claim. They say time heals all wounds, but I have learned that time is neither healer nor enemy. It is witness. It remembers what we try to forget. It holds the echoes of every choice, and it does not forgive. I sit now with the weight of those echoes. Some nights they are quiet. Other nights they roar like a tempest, but always they remind me of the cost. There is a story if I'd never told. A story of a man who stood at a crossroads. The king's envoys demanded loyalty. The rebels begged for leadership. The people cried for peace. And he chose none. He chose instead to walk away, to fade into the shadow of history, to become the silence between battles. That man was me. I often wonder what might have been. If I had fought harder, if I had won, if I had been the kind of man who could embrace bloodshed as necessity, would the world be different? Would the children be safer? Would the women sleep without fear? Or would the soil still drink deeply of sacrifice? They do not have answers, only questions, that burn hotter with each passing day. What is victory? What is honor? What is the true cost of power? And who pays it when the battle is done? I close this record not with certainty, but with hope, that those who read it will see beyond the battles, beyond the banners, beyond the blood and fire, to the quiet courage of refusal, to the strength it takes to choose mercy in a merciless world. to the legacy of those who refused to win and in doing so changed the course of history. If this is my last testament, let it be known, I chose peace, not because it was easy, but because it was the only true victory I could claim. In that choice, I found freedom. There is a peculiar loneliness in choosing a path unseen. Not the loneliness of silence, but the loneliness of conviction, of carrying a secret burden that no one else will bear. I have walked this path, sometimes surrounded by men and women who understood, more often alone, watching the world cheer for blood and conquest, while I treasured restraint and the lives spared. I think now of the boy on the hillside, of Cala's eyes when she stood before the flames, of Roland's fingers tracing maps faded with time. They were my company, my conscience, my reason. Even in exile, even in darkness, even as history tried to erase me. And now, as the last pages turn, I am reminded that history is not written by those who conquer. It is written by those who remember. By those who tell the stories of those who refused to win, who chose mercy over victory, who found strength in restraint, who left behind a world not of ruins, but of seeds. The last page is blank. The quill rests, and the tower waits.